This is Asia Pacific, a land of remote populations scattered across wide expanses and endless island chains. Yet here, connectivity is challenging to deliver and often unaffordable for everyday customers. One company is changing that. Asia Pacific satellite broadband operator Pacific has launched its Ka-band satellite Pacific One to provide high-speed, reliable broadband connectivity to rural and suburban communities at an affordable price. Now, Pacific is deploying innovative breakthroughs on the ground with a new line of high-performance and cost-effective broadband terminals.
We connect the unconnected masses of Southeast Asia and the Pacific at an affordable price. At Pacific, we are committed to enabling businesses, governments, and communities to fully participate in the digital world.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Is the Philippines the Next Big Digital Divide Market? By way of background, Southeast Asia and Oceania have become the hotbed of digital inclusion projects, specifically with initiatives coming from NBN in Australia, BAKTI in Indonesia, and MCMC in Malaysia. In March 2021, 1 year ago, Executive Order number 127 was signed into law in the Philippines, which expands the provision of internet services through inclusive access to satellite services, allowing enfranchised telecommunications entities, value service providers, and ISPs to be allowed access to all satellite systems, whether fixed or mobile, international or domestic, as well as to build and operate broadband facilities. Is this law the market signal that will usher in dynamic and robust growth for satellite connectivity services in the 7,100 island Philippine archipelago? We're joined by a very distinguished group of panelists. We have Dr. Joel Marciano, Director General for Philippine Space Agency, John Garrity, Chief of Party for USAID's Better Access and Connectivity, or Beacon project, being implemented by Nathan and Associates, Robert Suber, Managing Sales Director for Oceania in the Philippines at Intelsat, and Brandon Sear, Chief Commercial Officer for Pacific Broadband Satellites Group. Welcome, gentlemen. So first off, please provide a brief introduction of your organization and your activities in bridging the digital divide in the Philippines. Let's start with Dr. Marciano, please. Joel.
Thank you, Jose. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Well, the Philippine Space Agency, or we call it PhilSA, was established by the Philippine Space Act of 2019. So we're a relatively young agency, and it's the central government agency addressing all national issues and activities related to space science and technology applications. And that's a key phrase. We call it for short SSTA. We're the primary policy, planning, coordinating, implementing, and administrative entity in Philippine government for the National Space Program. And in relation to bridging the digital divide, relevant key development areas include, well, there's space research and development for spurring rapid scientific growth in vital areas of space and allied fields, and space industry capacity building for fostering private sector involvement and cooperation in space activities. So in this regard, PhilSA is also mandated to develop, construct, acquire, manage, maintain, operate space research and operation facilities on behalf of the government for use by various stakeholders. Now, we consider internet connectivity through satellites as an important downstream utilization or application of space science and technology. And the mega constellations and corresponding increase in frequency of rocket launches are significant components of the space upstream. So PhilSA is here, not just for the ride, or to be a spectator, but to help the Philippines contribute to this exciting space journey.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll hear more from your digital divide initiatives later on. John, on the ground, Beacon is about a 3-year project. Is that correct?
Actually, Jose, it's a 5-year project.
Oh, 5-year project.
Got a few more years. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and also to APSCC for the opportunity to join the panel. The Better Access and Connectivity Project, which was launched by USAID Philippines last June of 2021. It's a 5-year project really focused on working closely with the government of the Philippines to help accelerate and advance development of the digital infrastructure ecosystem here in the country. So it's a 5-year technical assistance project. And essentially what we're working on are a range of activities with our government of Philippines counterparts to drive, for example, flagship initiatives of the Department of ICT when it comes to, for example, the National Broadband Plan and some of the activities there. We also are focused very much on the policy and regulatory environment, really trying to help increase competition and quality of service when it comes to broadband internet connectivity. And we're also working on cybersecurity technical capacity. So while we also focus on the infrastructure and the ability for people to participate in the digital economy, we're making sure to concurrently have a focus on cybersecurity technical capacity issues, which we know are also ever increasing. So we're very excited to be working closely with a number of the partners, even on the call here. And as a 5-year project, we're very much interested in working on satellite development and satellite issues over the course of the next few years.
Excellent. Thank you, John. I work for USAID briefly, and if I'm not mistaken, this Beacon project is the first USAID project for connectivity purposes. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the first bilateral project really focused on digital infrastructure development, and the mission in the Philippines is really driving the case here. But there will be other projects. USAID has a focus on helping to improve internet connectivity across the board. So even in the region, there are other projects that are in development, focusing on the same topic but a different set of countries.
Great, excellent. Robert, you've been very busy. You were here a couple of weeks ago. We didn't get a chance to meet because you were just bogged down with meetings. Which is good, but bad too because we didn't get to see each other. But very interesting developments in the Philippines. Well, Intelsat is the signatory when it was still an intergovernmental organization. So you have a lot of inroads in a lot of countries, including the Philippines. What's going on with Intelsat and the Philippines with digital divide?
Sure. Look, and yes, it was a pity that we couldn't meet. I blame half of that to the traffic in Manila, but we all know that you can't remedy that quickly. Indeed, Intelsat is the world's perhaps oldest performing satellite operator. It's been around since the 60s and certainly involved in the Philippines for a very, very long time. Just by way of introduction of Intelsat, we've got 52 satellites which we fly, and 4 of those happen to be providing coverage across the Philippines at the moment. Our target market segments are the media and broadcasting organizations, government agencies, military, telecommunications, mobile network operators, and mobility networks is now a large part of our business brief as well. So globally, we're providing TV and radio content to over 2 billion viewers. Our commercial aviation business is now providing Wi-Fi to over 3,000 aircraft. And we are also the #1 provider to maritime and cruise market vessels. And we all know how important that market is to the Philippines community as well, servicing the top mobile network operators, but specifically to the Philippines. With the 4 satellites which I've mentioned, we're providing C and KU band frequency for the country and providing high availability services. And what we're doing at the moment in the Philippines, we're currently active in the media and broadcasting sector. We're also working to deepen broadband connectivity in the country through a partner called BCNet, who's actually rolling out the government or DICT free Wi-Fi project. We're also working with the Philippines Chamber of Commerce and the DICT to roll out a proof of concept, which is going to be made operational across a number of the barangays in the Philippines, again, to demonstrate the benefits, both social and, could we say, commercial for the Philippine communities. So with that, we're also providing capacity and services through partners like One Commerce to the military of the Philippines. And we've been working in this space, as I mentioned, for many, many decades. And I think that the Philippines are at an inflection point at the moment where it is going to be an exciting market to be involved with over the coming years.
Excellent. So you think it's the next big digital divide country?
Indeed. Market? Indeed. With over 109 million people, it has to be.
Okay. Well, Malaysia was mentioned, but population-wise, we're way ahead. So, okay. All right. Finally, Brandon from Pacific. As opposed to Intelsat, you could be considered the new kid on the block, right? You're a new operator entering the Asia-Pacific market specifically. I know you're branching out to other regions, but you've been busy as well, just like Robert. We've watched the announcements. You've been providing connectivity to schools in remote and rural areas. So tell us a little bit more about Pacific, please.
Thank you, Jos. Thank you for having us here. And I'd like to thank our colleagues from APSCC to give us the opportunity. Pacific has been the market ever since 2013. We have launched the first satellite that's focused on providing broadband, and it operates K-band that actually covers 25 countries in 2019. We have got our teleports in the Philippines and Indonesia and Australia. So Philippines for us is a very important market, which we actually cover the market with 6 powerful high throughput K-band beams, and that has offered a huge bulk of capacity that can actually focus on different areas. Our key segments in the Philippines remain the government. Through the government, we have been connecting schools and clinics, like you said. We have been also recently connecting communities in barangays where we promote the community Wi-Fi and broadband connectivity for SMEs. Our key partners in the Philippines today are Eastern Communication. We have got some of the other regional partners, and recently, in the last 2 years, due to restrictions, we have also managed to basically build a distribution channel of about 200 cable operators and retailers where they can offer, resell, and manage to basically install the antennas in these areas. We have successfully connected over 100,000 communities so far, and we see that a lot of that are in areas like Tari-Tari, Sulu, Cebu, Zamboanga, and goes further to Mindanao and Batanes on the top. What we have seen so far we could achieve with the Pacific in Pacific One in the Philippines is basically high throughput or high speeds and smaller antennas, a much better, or I should say, a more affordable rate or price for the terminal setup, as well as access and affordability on price per GB and price per Mbps. So yes, we have started with a humble beginning, and we are new in the block as a new operator, but we have taken this step forward to make broadband more affordable and connect the unconnected, which is about 32% of the population in the Philippines. Thank you.
Great. All right. Let me stay with you. 100,000 communities. That's quite impressive, given that, again, you're the new kid on the block, so to speak. So you've got Pacific, new entrant, Intelsat, the oldest satellite company in the world. But Asia is the most fragmented and the most competitive in terms of regional landscape, right? So there are so many operators from the global entities like Intelsat. We have national operators. The Philippines had Mabuhay Satellite before, now being purchased by ABS. So in terms of the law, EO 127, 1 year today, did it help with your work on connecting the 100,000 communities, or it hasn't had much impact yet? Brandon.
Here, just as I mentioned, the law has helped us expedite the connectivity into the rural areas. That's how we started the, connecting and onboarding about 200 distributors. Most of these distributors would work with the VAS operators and ISPs with a valid license that they actually promote, install, and resell the services. Definitely, the law has helped. I think the next step to the law is to really look into the regulatory spectrum fees, the taxes, because every time we offer an affordable rate per GB or per Mbps, there's an additional 40 to 45% margin added on the top of that to be able to comply with taxes, as well as pay the spectrum fees and make some margin. So we are really concerned on the end user terminal fee and the end user price per Mbps and per GB. So as such, that's the only way we see the demand in broadband expanding. And as we focus on mass market and connecting the public, that's an area to probably grow further, which is what we have done to subsidize to a great degree and offer terminal fees much cheaper so that bigger communities and larger communities can be connected while we connect the enterprises. We have also encouraged sharing infrastructure. So if a site is put in a place, just to give you an example, a 1.2 meter standard antenna with Pacific today can achieve up to 55, 60 Mbps, the cheaper version. That costs about $600 landed and installed for a customer. And then what we try to do is we try to share the same infrastructure with communities and schools so that the same site can offer bandwidth for people around the area. So that has helped us a lot in terms of expanding the network. Thanks.
Excellent. Robert, do you agree? Law has helped, but a lot of things still need to happen.
Yeah, look, indeed, the laws help. And if anything else, it's helped the narrative of satellite in the Philippines. It's introduced it as a new product and market opportunity. Quite frankly, I think it's still greenfields. If you do look at the effects of satellite across the Philippines over the last couple of decades, its penetration is still extremely low. And I think that in a country where you've got 7,500 islands and a massive population, as I mentioned earlier, it is technically and perhaps commercially impossible for the terrestrial substitutes for connectivity and backhaul to take hold. And I'm referring to, for example, microwave or domestic fiber links, etc. So what is the fastest way to market? The most cost-effective way to market has to be satellite. I think with the Executive Order 127, we're starting to see a lot of new interest in service providers which would have possibly not considered that technology as a real means of entering a market in the Philippines. And we can look right across the country from north to south, the barangays and the GIDA-defined locations to be perfectly suited to satellite as a solution. I think the fact that we had such a tightly regulated market up till last year did not help achieve that kind of penetration across the market. What is exciting now is that with the new entrants, they will be able to, unleash their own products for the market. They'll have different go-to-market strategies. They'll set up dealers, resellers, or their own direct sales teams to run around and connect these townships, these villages, these small businesses. The service providers that are in the country will choose to build their own earth stations, build their own teleports or gateways, or they'll take wholesale managed services and resell those. So there's many ways of entering the market quickly and start having an immediate effect. As I said, I think it's greenfields, and there's a lot of opportunity for growth in the Philippines, thanks to Executive Order 127.
Great. All right. Thank you. John, your thoughts on EO 127. I attended a workshop that you run, I think 3 weeks ago, about connectivity, and you invited the government, PLDT, Converge, Globe. And if I'm not mistaken, and maybe I missed it, satellite in your 4-hour workshop wasn't mentioned at all, not once. So with EO 127, is that going to change? Is it going to be part of the toolkit now?
Jose, I think we'll have to go back because I think we did mention satellite towards the end, but you're absolutely right. It wasn't the feature. I agree with what Robert has said. It should be, because satellite should be a feature of the overall approach to connecting all of the unconnected communities in the Philippines because of the challenges of having an archipelago where terrestrial and undersea fiber networks can't reach every single community. So satellite certainly plays an important role in extending access. With regard to EO 127, I think it was a very positive sign and development by the government of the Philippines to issue EO 127. And as you know, it had broad support from across government, including champions, for example, from Bangko Sentral de Filipinas, because of the implications for financial inclusion. I think, one of the things about EO 127 is that it's an executive order. So one of the things we want to ensure moving forward is more sort of institutionalization of the provisions of EO 127. Also, I think the impact of EO 127 will really be determined by the implementation of the executive order. There is an accreditation process for SSPOs, as you know, in the EO, and then of course there are other registration issues that I think other colleagues have mentioned. There are other issues, of course, when it comes to barriers to entry that still remain in the Philippines, and we're starting to see the government of the Philippines really address a number of those other barriers to entry. As you're familiar, the Public Services Act amendment also passed, and so that allows for greater foreign investment in telecommunications. But there's still other challenges, and I think the franchise license requirement for telecommunications provision is also something that could be addressed to spur greater entry into the market. But really, the proof is in the pudding, and I think we heard from our colleagues from Pacific and Intelsat already seeing more interest in satellite telecommunication services, in more partners reaching out to satellite providers. So really, it's a very positive development, and one that I hope the momentum continues moving forward to address some of the other lingering barriers to entry.
The franchise law you were referring to is the congressional franchise, correct?
Correct.
Which is rare because I think we're the only country in the world that has that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So Joel, being the quote unquote government representative on space, what do you think of EO 127? They like it. Stakeholders think, though, that it's not enough. Many other regulatory and economic adjustments have to be made. What's your view from PhilSA?
Well, it was well supported also by the cabinet and this administration, I should say. And one intent really is to be able to increasingly offer satellites as a viable option for connectivity, especially in low density, population density areas and challenging areas. It allows for entities such as ISPs and VASPs, value-added service providers, to directly access satellite systems and to build out a network and access spectrum without the need for a franchise. So these barriers have been lowered. And as I understand it, a consortium of banks can register as a value-added service provider and build out a satellite-based network so they can connect their branches, ATMs, and address financial inclusion objectives. But affordability is still a concern. EO 127 is as good as it is and as promising as it is. It's not a panacea. The proof is in the pudding, as John said, but it does enable, and we'd be very keen to see groups like cooperatives to become VASPs, and they can self-organize and directly access satellites, perhaps, and bond together and secure capacity and access spectrum and build out as community networks. Briefly, these community networks operate on a cost recovery basis rather than strictly for commercial gain. And there are many examples around the world in rural communities that have successfully established such small cooperative-owned networks. And also to further address affordability on an individual and household level, governments and other groups could work together with consumer and development financing institutions on viable schemes for reducing upfront costs, such as distributed financing or amortization of equipment. So yeah, it sets us up towards the right path, and but of course the execution implementation is largely to be seen.
Okay, so we will look to you, Joel, as our champion here in the Philippines. We know that it's the DICT that really is in charge of regulatory systems, but it's good to have you on our side. Follow up, Joel. You mentioned cost. The PhilSA has been established, very early, I think 2 years ago, but that has been pushed over the past 5 or 6 years. Why haven't satellites, for their obvious advantages, ubiquity, quick deployment, cost-effective features, it's not been used by telcos and other players in the value chain? And Robert, John, and Brandon have mentioned it. And we did have a satellite company, and that was purchased by ABS. So seems like, looking at satellites, the Philippines is not too much, it's not in the radar. Is there any reason for that? Is it lack of education, lack of information? What's going on? We're coming in late, I think.
Yeah, thanks for that. Personally, I do not know if I go back far enough. Maybe I do, but let me try. Policy-wise, I think in the Philippines, prior to EO 127, direct access to satellites was limited to enfranchised telecommunication entities authorized by the National Telecommunications Commission. So that was a kind of a big hurdle, if you will. Technology-wise, building and deploying satellites took relatively a longer time, and the cost of equipment and cost of ownership is quite steep, even in high volume. On the business end, perhaps there was much reliance on subscription models for engaging customers. Issues about reliability with rain fades in a tropical country affecting Ka frequencies are brought up by common people, people you ask on the street. And so perhaps there's also a reputation or issue or concern associated with robustness of the connection. But now, launch costs are going down. Satellites are being manufactured and deployed quicker, perhaps marching at a rollout pace that competes better with that of terrestrial infrastructure. There are link diversity and other fade mitigation techniques being employed to address the physics. There are more space players now, and they're more diverse with their technologies and business models. There are LEOs and MEOs and even small sats in GEO with their lean, non-traditional risk-taking development approach to spacecraft building. So the demand for broadband is still surging. And of course, with the exacting requirements of online education, productivity, telemedicine, interactive gaming, these are all coming together. These are all quite promising in terms of larger market adoption of satellite technology moving forward. And so EO 127 enters into this picture, so it's quite good timing.
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not that the Philippine stakeholders are unaware. It's just the technical market and other issues associated with satellite services didn't come to the forefront to address digital divide problems.
Well, there's also awareness, I guess. A more promotion of the technology, and now that we have a space agency, that's one thing you can count on, is to shine the spotlight on the space segment with recent advances and with trickling down to business models and all of that. So yeah, so that's why we're also here, and we're working with the DICT and other government agencies and the private sector to shine the spotlight.
Great, thank you. Robert, you agree with that? Even being present here for, I guess, the longest time? Intelsat, that is.
I think satellite is the ideal solution for the type of markets that we're trying to address in the Philippines for all the reasons that we mentioned before. I think one of the key things that we need to do as a satellite industry is make sure that we are positioning the product correctly. In my view, satellite, there's not one form of satellite application that fits all sizes. And perhaps if we think about, the 81 provinces that, the Philippines has and the population densities as a factor of this. So what you'll find in the Philippines is that in some provinces, you'll have about 60 people per square kilometre. In other provinces, you'll have 3,000 people per square kilometre. And if you were a telecommunications or mobile network operator, you have to think about how you address each province with your architectural topology differently. So it makes commercial and technical sense. So this means that we as a satellite industry have to get a lot better in being able to work with our partners to help them choose the architecture that fits their market. Now, they may be deploying simple access solutions, such as a broadband directly to a home, or they may be using satellite for backhaul, for Wi-Fi hotspots, or even cellular backhaul, could we say, applications. And what we have found is that Wi-Fi hotspots, for example, are ideally placed where we have population centers of 0 to 300 people. And if you have anything over 300 to say 2,000 or 3,000, you can start looking at new small cell technology. So the likes of Globe or PLDT Smart should look at small cell to fill in amongst all of their macro base stations to provide connectivity to the end user, and then use satellite as a backhaul to achieve connections using their 3 or 4G product sets. We've got to remember that the traditional form of dropping a base station into a village or town requires substantial investment, $200,000 or $300,000 per base station, and closing that business case has always been the issue for many of these operators, especially when you've got ARPUs as low as $5. So you've got to really look at what satellite solution is fit for purpose. We as an industry have to do, I think, a lot more in sizing the network with our partners, choosing the right frequency, which is going to allow for a terrific user experience. So in my view, we've got to sit down and work closely with these emerging new partners as a result of Executive Order 127, help them with the traffic analysis, the modeling, getting the application right for the population density. And that's how we're going to be successful. And I think that hasn't been done in the legacy franchise model. And that's why we've seen such poor penetration through to today.
I'm reading off of your statements and saying to myself, in your chip here, you probably talked to Globe and PLDT to adopt the satellite solution. But maybe you're not in a position to answer that. We will take that as a yes. Brandon, you've signed on partners in the Philippines, and congratulations to you. But in terms of scale, going back to what Robert has mentioned, you really have to go to the big dominant telcos like PLDT and Globe. How is that in terms of, I'm sure you've talked to them too, how is that in terms of them adopting the satellite solution and specifically Pacific solution?
Thanks. Just to build on my colleague's opinion, Robert has actually pointed out a few areas. Let me give you a background of the type of homework we have done. So we basically went to the main telecos. We took the 7,100, 7 islands basically, and we really looked at the penetration of these islands, and we found out that about 40% of these islands are hardly connected. The first thing we had to do was basically had to see the business case against the ARPUs. We see the ARPUs are about $2.50 on prepaid market in these areas, and the telecos are really interested in covering the urban areas and economic centers, because to build a site in an area where you have 500 or 600 population, an area like Sulu or any of these islands, it actually requires a different type of capex altogether. And if they are not going to be able to actually generate about $3,000 or $2,500 per site per month, the business case fails by a great degree. So what we have tried to do is to see if the telecoms are ready to adapt their model. As Robert said, maybe just offer community Wi-Fi first as proof of solution, grow the market, penetrate the island, and then find out how many other eligible customers are there, what's the economy of the scale, how's the power of purchase, and then penetrate the market further from there. If the model works very well in one island, it has to work the same way in different islands, and that could be basically deployed in different places. Unfortunately, I think the telecos are quite busy in managing the business and trying to adapt in the economic centers and compete in those areas with the new entrant. They're not really looking into these smaller markets, although I see a number of initiatives that has come in. We had to go down to the value chain ourselves to prove that K-band works, because the first thing we have heard in the last 2 years is that K-band might not really work with the rain fate in the Philippines. So we had to do our own trial and connect the communities and basically prove to the telecos that the K-band is viable. You can actually integrate it to your network. You can expand the mobile backhaul. Here are the type of products we can do together, and prove the CapEx model. So as such, we had to go down the value chain and build that for them. And I think they're still quite busy on remodeling some of the functions of the business to compete and expand. I see a few initiatives coming up from the main telecos now that they're open to look into the mobile backhaul, community Wi-Fi, or a hybrid solution of as such. Telecos have also not been able to integrate the satellite as such, the K-band, to their profile of products to offer to their enterprises, because the interest remains on connecting the enterprises through microwave or E1 links, because that's where they make probably the highest margin. So we had to also reorganize the products further. Work with operators like Eastern Communications, PT&T, and others that I can name to see how we can be part of the deployment for the new products that's coming across. I should say that the feedback and the input that we have received from accepting the satellite solutions has been very positive this year. It has not been the same in the previous years, because K-band and as well as the satellite technology has been the last option to say. in terms of products to offer them to an enterprise community. Obviously, the end user price becomes very important, as the telcos also put a really good margin on these services. So that's where we see the challenges to build on your feedback.
Great. All right. Thank you. John, very consistent from Brandon, Joel, Robert, it's cost. It's margins. To commercialize satellite services, telcos have to make a decent amount of money to enable this. So question for you, who pays? And for everyone, I'll go around the table. So BAKTI in Indonesia, NBN in Australia, MCMC in Malaysia, all have funding mechanisms to pay for their digital divide programs. What model does the Philippines need to adapt? You mentioned that Beacon is a start. You will have more projects. How do you address the ability to pay and just the funding mechanism to make the digital divide value proposition work here?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jose. I mean, it's fascinating to listen to Robert and to Brandon really describe some of the economics behind their calculations on how to really address remote communities. I mean, I think maybe just going back a little bit to that discussion, I know Dr. Marciano shared a lot of the trends in the history that are changing in the dynamics of satellite connectivity. But really, I think one of the things that we're seeing is the resurgence, at least I think in the public domain, of the importance of satellite connectivity for redundancy and for resilience. I mean, we saw that here in the Philippines in the aftermath of Typhoon Odette. We've seen that in the Pacific with what happened in Tonga and the problems there with the undersea cable. So really, I mean, it feels as though people are starting to perk up and remember, oh yeah, satellite, right? Satellite is a way to connect some of these communities. And really, maybe just to stress this point about affordability that I know has been touched on. I mean, the economics of reaching remote and rural communities on a per bandwidth basis just haven't really been there for low income consumers in low population density areas. So really, the advances in the technology of satellite broadband in launch costs, as Dr. Marciano points out, have really enabled the numbers to work out to try and figure out how can you use satellite to connect some of these communities. And that's why I think it's fascinating to hear what Brandon is saying and also Robert about some of the solutions for backhaul, for mobile networks, but then community Wi-Fi. And I'd love to dig into that a little bit more and hear how is community Wi-Fi really working, where you have really small consumption amounts per user, but then backhauling through satellite. That's fascinating to know that they're deploying that here. When it comes to your question about who pays, certainly there are different models, and you point out various different ones. I think one of the things that we've seen to be so effective in places like Indonesia, as an example, is a very dedicated universal access and universal service program that is spearheaded by the government of Indonesia. And it's very broad-based, right? I mean, they've got Palapa Ring, they've got satellite connectivity, a focus on remote towers, on public access. And so with a very expansive program like that, you can really tackle all of the issues that are the binding constraint. And one of the binding constraints that we see in the Philippines is really the cost of backhaul. It's not necessarily the lack of access networks. There's a lot of regional ISPs, but it's really in the cost of transit and backhaul. And so if you can address that through dedicated programming, then I think that could really help this market. So how do you do that? I mean, certainly the support for wholesale open access networks could be one way to do that. It could be greater competition for entities that can provide backhaul services. So there's a range of different ways to do it, but certainly a large-scale dedicated universal access program like what we see in Indonesia is a good model to consider.
Just follow up. So if I'm hearing you correctly, yes, the BAKTI Indonesia program, NBN Australia, MCMC, Malaysia, adopt some of that, but some of your comments also indicate to me at least that technology will bring us there to bring the cost down. So on the balance between government involvement in funding and unleashing the marketplace. What's the balance to bridge the digital divide here? Is it 50-50, which is government commercial, or a little bit more on government, maybe like 75-25? What's your view there, John?
Yeah, well, I think it'd be hard to sort of segment in terms of proportionality that way, but certainly in addressing the issues, there's certain things that government is very well placed to exercise its tools. For example, in policy and regulatory constraints, right? This issue of competition in landing points, in backhaul, in entities that can provide middle mile connectivity. That's an area where through policy and regulatory action, the government could certainly address. And it may be better placed to do that through policy and regulatory issues to spur competition and private sector investment, rather than necessarily do like an NBN model or government owned networks.
Joel, do you agree with that?
Let me add something about the Universal Access Service Fund. It's actually in the National Broadband Plan of 2017 of the DICT. It was recommended by the NTC and captured. There are programs where you can say the government has picked up the check, so to speak, such as these People Connect and free Wi-Fi access, public access programs. So a combination of these approaches, and we're working together with NGOs and financing institutions as well to come up with viable schemes that could address on a larger scale the needs of these communities. But let me also say, I think it's also important to know where these communities are, where the unconnected are, because then you can have a more surgical approach towards these incentives and target these communities where there's a priority for the connectivity. We speak about in the Philippines about how we need connectivity in broad strokes, but where exactly are these regions? And so and then incentivize groups to come in and provide services there as a matter of priority. And so, yeah, population density is one factor. Of course, there are other demographics. Yep.
I like that term, surgical. So we can have broad strokes, but when it comes to implementation, we are 7,107 islands. So you may have to go island per island and see what business case works there. Robert, you agree with that? Or do you want to have an anchor client that drives spending?
I tend to support what Joel has observed from the Philippine market. There seems to be more of a focus on initiating schemes by the government, such as the Wi-Fi projects. And if you look at other countries as well, rather than just a central USO policy, they tend to initiate black spot programs, for example, where they target areas of most need or interest or requirement and therefore focus efforts in that way. The traditional USO models, they are perhaps the most effective. If you look at the concept of setting aside budget by the government or putting a levy onto existing service providers to create a USO bucket of money, that all takes time. It also is a process then of getting pre-qualified service providers to dispense with those fundings and put in place the infrastructure that's required. So it takes some time. The fastest way to market in terms of achieving change is through a targeted scheme or a surgical approach, as Joel has mentioned. If I look to Australia, for example, the NBN Co, it was an investment by the taxpayer of $2 billion just for the 2 satellites and the 13 ground stations. Now, I think if I look to the Philippines, it's in a much more fortunate position. It already has satellite operators, Intelsat, Pacific, and several others, who have already invested in satellites, which are sitting above the country, which have got frequency and bandwidth available to you today. I think also, if you look to the ground segment in the Philippines, you've already got a number of ground earth station providers, teleport operators, which are already interconnected to the subsea cable system and the domestic cable system. So you've already got the space and the ground available to the Philippine, could we say, industry. So what we now need to do is really then look towards collaboration. I think that the government is an essential part of that. It's got 42,000 barangays, and I'm sure that many of those could act as a form of seed for connectivity. So the DICT, directing funds in that direction for connectivity is one strategy that could be implemented. Then you've got private enterprise. And I think that the fact that the Philippines has about 1 million small enterprises, many of those, again, remain unconnected. And they are end users with real demand and real money to spend with the satellite industry. And then finally, in my view, the third, could we say, step of collaboration is with entrepreneurs. If the government could, in fact, provide grants or subsidies or tax incentives for entrepreneurs to enter the market, it could be down from the sari star all the way to some entrepreneur in a town that is prepared to take this mantle up and run with it, I think you would see a successful outcome. So in my view, there's probably 3 planks to succeeding in the who pays question.
Great. All right. Brandon, you agree? Surgical pillars of growth, anchor tenant in the government. What are your thoughts?
Coming from a telecom background, from Middle East and Africa, I should say I have a very divided feeling in witnessing what we have done in Indonesia with BAKTI. What we have seen are these facts that I'm going to mention here. So you've got today 70% to 75% of the fund that's actually paid for broadband access in the remote areas that comes from the LGOs, government agencies, and the ICT. If you actually look at the number of organizations that contribute to this, is the police, the ICT, post office, election committee, and it goes on all the way to certain schools and education ministry, right? And obviously it comes down to the LGU budget there. There is an opportunity, as Robert said, the teleports are there, the satellites are in place right now. In places where I've worked in Africa before, they didn't even have the satellite. We had to find parties to actually launch a satellite first in order to get connected in the remote areas. We see a great opportunity because the bandwidth is there, the satellite has been established. If a party like the ICT can consolidate all the requirements and purchase the capacity directly, then assign it to the LGOs through the local providers, that would be a great win there because they can achieve a much better price. They can also negotiate the capacity down to the LGO level. The consolidation will help to negotiate a different price or a much better price per Mbps from the satellite operators fund. And this can be really prioritized as a universal strategy. And I think that universal strategy will assess the LGOs and all the other entities to submit their requests to the government, get it consolidated, they can break it down, and then the maintenance operators, the installers, and the likes of the distributors that we have signed can actually install this and connect different people in different areas. As I said, again, I think bandwidth is one part of the challenge. The second part of the challenge is the terminals, the hardware that you have to choose and install in these areas, because we have a number of different options, but these options are not cheap because you have to mobilize it in certain areas. And today, from the 3 warehouses we have, sometimes it takes about 25 to 30 days to mobilize a site in an area. So this really requires a one entity, a focus group to strategize it better, a global consolidation of the budget, negotiation with the satellite operators to embed that capacity and product together would definitely help. But I think at the same time, if we want to continue down the route of what we're doing today, then we really have to look at the spectrum fees and the taxes around this to make it affordable. Because what I think we are trying to do is we're trying to commoditize broadband, but commoditizing broadband without solving the few affordability issues, including hardware, would be a very tough ask. And that's what we have been trying to do with the ICT and the other likes of the government agencies. And again, I think with the ICT and the other government agencies, because the contracts renew every year, it's very difficult to actually renew from one contract to another contract. It takes about 2 months at times to review the offers. The process is quite lengthy. And the idea is to come up with a model that, people can pay by themselves and communities can start paying by themselves after the first year. We have seen that likes of the projects that, they stay for a year, and then after a year, the budget has run out and people are disconnected for a couple of months. And we have the cases right now. So I think this may require a different focus. This may require a different strategy altogether, and a bit of openness in trying to connect people in the remote areas, and prioritizing that on the national level will probably help by a great degree.
Great. All right. So hearing everyone, so the example is BAKTI Indonesia, NBN Australia, MCMC Malaysia. They all have satellites and have funded satellites. What I'm hearing, though, here in the Philippines, don't do it. If the government has the funds for a digital divide program, don't launch a satellite, build a satellite. It's expensive. Refine the business model so that you address affordability. And whether it's a surgical approach, a business model approach, that's how you do it. You don't create a BAKTI, you don't create an NBN, you don't launch a satellite. Just refine the business case. And if you have to do it in 7,107 islands, that's the way to do it. Is that agreed?
Let me weigh in on that a little bit, Jose. We also keep tabs, for government to keep tabs on developments on the technology front. I mean, the options are also there for also these satellites that could be built out in the future. There are other groups in the Philippines that might require certain specifications on satellites that would, as far as security and all of these things are concerned. So, but it's a promising landscape now. It's evolving, and the technological advancements are there, are motivating even for these things to be considered even more. It's a combination of these things, but also to keep track of these technologies and the ecosystem that's evolving.
Great. And I know that PhilSA is looking into remote sensing, Earth observation, very helpful for our country, especially with agriculture, weather. And what I'm hearing, Joel, is that you can do that for communication satellites as well. Like Astranis is a smaller GEO-HTS payload. Is that something that you're looking into as well?
Well, there are these options, as I mentioned, Jose. It's an exciting field. Having all these options and having these things right now is it wasn't there before. So, and I think that's good. And there are other things, other targets for government to hit here. For example, opening the door to space-adjacent companies in the Philippines to be in the supply chain, to compete for opportunities in the supply chain. We're talking about thousands of satellites that get replenished every 5 or 6 years, and so it's like almost like a vehicle now. There are even possibly second-hand satellites that are opening up. So they get replenished, and there's also some manufacturing chain now, and some opportunities open up for space-adjacent companies in the Philippines. So we're also looking at motivating them to look into that as well.
Okay, excellent. So talking about thousands of satellites is a good segue to the next question. So LEOs, our low Earth orbit satellites, are knocking on the door recently. You've got partnerships with SpaceX and ABS. I think PhilSA has invited SpaceX for a trial. Telesat, Kuiper, they're all coming in. John, you run a webinar last week on LEO systems and how they can, provide services to rural underserved areas. What's your view on LEOs in terms of the market landscape here in the Philippines?
Well, I think it relates back to some of the things that even Brandon was mentioning with regard to capacity and bandwidth over countries, including the Philippines. I think the interesting thing about the billions of dollars that are going into investment in low Earth orbit satellite constellations for satellite broadband and the thousands of satellites that have been launched by the various companies is the fact that we're keen to see to what extent it really extends coverage and access of broadband internet, and what it will do to the cost of bandwidth, right? I mean, the expectation is that these constellations will be putting tens of terabits per second of capacity overhead. And so, when you have an expansion of supply of that nature, the expectation would be that the cost for bandwidth would fall dramatically. And so when it goes back to the affordability discussion, what we're keen to see is if the launch of these LEO systems and their entry in the Philippines will have a concurrent impact on affordability for individual low-income internet users.
Okay, so it's a very welcome development from where you're sitting, at least.
Correct. Well,
Great.
but to be seen.
To be seen. All right. Robert, they're going to be competing. So low Earth orbit, different orbit configuration, lots of capacity to be placed. You and Brandon are geo satellite operators. Big capacity, but not to the level that the LEOs are promising to provide. What do you think? What do you think of their entrance here in the Philippines? Let's start with you, Robert.
Yeah, again, much like Executive Order 127, again, the LEO press releases are, again, lifting the profile of satellite across the Philippines. And I think that's positive, both in a political and commercial context. People are talking about satellite as a solution for the archipelago of the Philippines. So I think that's a positive thing. Intelsat's own strategy in context to LEO is to actually blend from time to time a GEO and LEO solution where it makes sense for where a customer may have a requirement for a low latency solution. We will be using SD-WAN blending solutions to ensure that a customer can have both the best of both worlds, LEO and GEO. So Intelsat is also looking at how it can use LEO as part of its own solution mix. When we turn our focus to the Philippines, I've been observing closely the proof of concepts underway. We understand that Telesat has put a proof of concept. OneWeb, certainly Starlinks is always in the press as well. I think when we think about the Philippine market, we have to be conscious of how the LEOs will work alongside key success factors such as pricing, their go-to-market strategy, and how climatically they'll be able to perform in the Philippines. If we look at the go-to-market element, first of all, we see that Starlinks is a vertically integrated model where you get online, you order an antenna, and you get connected. How does that fit in with the current regulatory model of the Philippines is to be seen. If you look at OneWeb, they're much more of a wholesale model where they will again work with partners in the country. The second issue prevailing around the LEO construct is pricing, and we spoke about ARPUs of $5 earlier. When we look to the LEO price points that are circulating in the market today, Starlinks for business solutions is US $500 a month, and the terminal's $2,500. A consumer product is US $100 and the terminal's $500. We know that OneWeb antenna technology is about $8,000. So these prices, are they germane to the Filipino pocket? That's what we've got to also look at, because a VSAT, a parabolic VSAT today, the solution installed will cost perhaps $1,000, and the total cost of ownership has to then be considered and applied to those business models which I spoke about earlier. So in terms of fit for purpose, the go-to-market pricing has to, I think, unfold. But I'm also one that looks at the mechanical side of the antenna solutions. I've been fortunate enough to handle some of these antennas and to look at their construct, I should say. And I'm just concerned about their survivability in a country which has got 20 typhoons a year. I know that traditional VSAT antennas are built to survive winds of 200 kilometers. I'm not sure how a LEO antenna will go in that environment. So there's some of the observations that we have as Intelsat, and certainly what I've observed in the Philippines at this point.
Great. So if I'm hearing you correctly, they're not a fit here. Remains to be seen whether their value proposition takes off. Brandon, do you agree with that?
If anything, I think with LEOs, it really helps us with awareness. It has helped us open doors in terms of talking about satellite technology overall with bigger organizations, organizations like Converge, and some of the other ones that has appeared in the market. I think one of the things that has to come up at one point is the cost of the terminal, as Robert said. The end user cost of the per Mbps has always been achieved in similar levels, I should say, by us and other operators in the Philippines. I see prices that has been floated in the market that we've been tracking based on trends. We can see a price per Mbps of about 150 all the way to $230 or $300, whether it's shared or uncontended. These rates are not unknown of. We have achieved these rates about 2 years ago when we actually launched the Pacific one. The terminal price of $8,000 to $12,000 to $13,000 is an actual challenge. I don't know how far these organizations would actually subsidize these terminals to offer it to the type of customers that we deal with in the Philippines. But also, in terms of durability, as Robert said, these terminals are not really made for a broadband or community sort of access on internet. Because what you could see is in a lot of these communities, it's very difficult to mobilize the terminals, but once you mobilize it, you have to install it in a place. It's also difficult to install it and find the right place for it. So as such, it may not be the right way to look at it. They may have a segment to offer these terminals and the service to the military, some of the government offices, maybe enterprises like the mining and maritime. They might be able to basically use the broadband to expand and penetrate in some of those segments. But if we look at the residential segment, and if we look at the telecom segment in terms of the SMEs and smaller enterprises, this may not be a great fit in terms of product. It's obviously good because it increases competition in the market. It gives us the chance and ability to talk about satellite more often and raises awareness, which is one of our key issues right now, because the awareness doesn't really stop with telecom operators and ISPs. We also have to educate people about the types of plans they're going to use, because the types of plans they offer in fiber and through mobile telecommunication services are very different with the satellite offers that we have in the market. So as such, it helps with awareness. I'm not really sure if, in terms of economy of scale, the cost of the remote terminals would actually fit this market in the long term.
All right. Thank you, Brandon. So Joel, final word on LEOs. What do you think?
Well, they do offer these further connectivity options and stimulate the broadband landscape, I guess, hopefully bringing healthy competition. And their presence, together with the implementation of EO 127, could mean working with with new, and let me emphasize, more diverse local value-added service providers and ISPs. Now, as far as LEOs and GEOs are concerned, there's this idea of cooperation rather. I think Robert mentioned that rather than competition. There's a so-called multi-orbit approach or strategy that leverages benefits of both, of either one, like the low latency of NGSOs, non-geosynchronous orbit satellites, and the higher, perhaps more targeted capacity provisioning ability of GEOs. So we should keep tabs on that. And well, I mentioned earlier that we also believe that introduction of these new space companies in the industry can eventually trickle into or open doors for local space adjacent companies to compete for supply chain opportunities for the space and ground segments. And that's one mandate of the Philippine Space Agency, is this industry capacity building. So in the downstream and upstream of space. Of course, the goal is further cost reductions or efficiencies in these either satellites or the ground station equipment. And because of these exciting developments on the technology and policy fronts, we thought we'd help push things a bit further along. We published an open call for these NGSO satellite constellations to sign up and send letters of intent to participate in test deployments, essentially to bring in these new space tech here, demonstrate, test, measure, assess, and open doors to groups now enabled by EO 127. As well as mentioned, opening doors to space-adjacent companies in the upstream. So Robert mentioned about validating these technologies in the Philippines as far as our country being geographically and environmentally different. So yeah, we're hoping to start the test deployments and associated R&D activities by Q2 of this year. And engaging with the satellite operators also draws attention to current relevant telecommunications regulations and their responsiveness. So developments brought about by these new players coming in could underscore the need to further update policies and accelerate proposed regulatory reform. So it's nothing like what was seeing it working right in front of you, and then helping push along whatever other reforms are needed for
Great.
sustainability.
Thank you, Joel. Could you disclose who answered your open call? And
well, we had a press release for one, and that's as far as I can go at the moment. Yeah, okay. So that's OneWeb has been announced. Yeah, so we're standby for further developments.
Okay, and we will. Thank you. All right, so unfortunately, we're at the top of the hour. We're just getting our discussions into more interesting ground. So far, lots of takeaways, but the one really big takeaway from me, and it's been the challenge for the satellite industry, has been the cost structure. Regulatory, I think that can be fixed. It's not an easy fix, but it's laws that are going to be implemented, and EO 127 certainly is the right direction. But addressing the cost structure to hit on the $5 per month ARPU level, the total cost of ownership, I think that issue has been dogged here in the Philippines and elsewhere. But again, you mentioned that technology will bring us there, regulations will bring us there, unique business models and partnerships will bring us there, so very encouraging. And as the Philippines enters the space race, the space market, certainly it's not just digital divide we are going to look for, remote sensing, military applications, agriculture, etc. Very exciting times indeed. So closing remarks, please, gentlemen. In the subject of the digital divide, what does the Philippines need to do in the short term, mid-term, long-term to succeed? Is it regulations, subsidies, government-run programs, development agency participation like USAID, ADB, etc.? What do you think will lead to a very quick bridging of the digital divide here? Let's start with Brandon, please.
Thank you, Joseph. Based on my notes and the conclusion to make, I think the first thing that I would actually leave the group with is the consolidation of the effort from the government agencies to consolidate the budget as well as consolidate the effort so that all the government agencies can negotiate a better price, also coordinate it better, and that will achieve better price per Mbps for end users, as well as for the government agencies to basically share the same infrastructure and the same capacity within different entities. The second thing I would leave the group with is also to help us raise awareness. I have seen the demand in LEOs, but LEOs are not there and they're going to come in 1 or 2 years. And as they adapt their model, which will take some time, we are there. We have got over 7 Gbps of capacity in the country. We have been connecting over 100,000 communities. We are reachable. We have got teams on the ground. We have got infrastructure on the ground. We can really utilize this capacity to connect the unconnected. So as such, if the gentlemen here in this group can help us arrange platforms to raise awareness, talk to the government agencies, potential customers through different conferences or through different events, that would be really helpful because that would come in as a joint effort together for the group. The third thing I would leave the group with is to actually think of a collaboration between the satellite operators. Like I know Robert for a long time and we have collaborated in different markets, but that collaboration can also happen on the ground where we can fit technologies in different places against coverage. If one can offer video, the other one can offer broadband access to same customers. I think the idea is to connect the unconnected and commoditize broadband and the services. So that collaboration will probably help. Now that the travel is open, hopefully we will come in to see different partners, but we will bump into each other in the same plane or flights or hotel. as we did before, or at the airports. I think that that will also assist us further, because that's how they do it in the US with Viasat and the other operators in Brazil. We have heard of the success stories in South Africa recently, with a few operators collaborating together to use a mix of GEO, MEO, and LEO, instead of launching different satellites at the same time, to see how they can address the market and potentially share revenue, right? Which is probably the aspect of the business to go.
Thank you. Co-opetition, as they say. Robert, what do you think? Closing remarks, please.
Yeah, thank you. So look, I think I'll just hit on 4 points. I think that the Executive Order 127 is the beginning of a journey for the Philippines. I think it's going to, if the focus remains on the initiative and we continue to grow the infrastructure, the processes and policies around it, I think it will transform and leverage existing assets in the Philippines. Secondly, I think between Brendan and I, we have demonstrated on this call that satellite can be used creatively, may it be for individual access requirements or for backhaul. And I think that for applications, may they be Wi-Fi hotspots to the backhaul of cellular towers or individual VSATs, the technology is there and available today, and it is cost effective. I think on my third point, in terms of government, its role and who pays, I think it's important that we have that collaborative approach to this problem in the Philippines, harnessing the local government units, the schools, the clinics, the police, etc., and somehow merging or aggregating their requirement and their budgets to successfully deploy connectivity in those barangays will have an immediate and very fast effect. My last point, the technology, the satellites, the ground segment is available today. It resides in the Philippines today. We're not having to wait for 2 years for a product to mature or for a new satellite to be built. We can start moving on this problem today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. John, your closing remarks, please.
Yeah, thanks, Jose. Maybe just to stress, I mean, from the perspective of our project of USAID Beacon, I mean, we really are focused on the impact and the importance of digital connectivity for its social and economic development impacts, right? I mean, I think one of the things that we know is that participation in the digital economy is sort of a double-edged sword. It helps to increase incomes and productivity, but the digital divide, as we've been focusing on, can really also the existing digital divide can really also play a role in exacerbating income inequality. And we've seen that throughout the COVID pandemic. So, you know, discussions like this are really important to try and surface solutions for how we can really accelerate progress towards closing the digital divide. Maybe just to say that, you know, from my perspective, this really takes an all hands on deck approach when we talk about how do we close the digital divide. Certainly from the public sector side, there's a number of things that we discussed today: awareness building, priming the pump, maybe anchor tenancy in terms of trying to spur some of these services, public financing, and then also financing from the donor community or the DFI community, and certainly also addressing some of the policy and regulatory constraints that could then encourage greater investment in some of these solutions. And then on the private sector side, like what we've heard from Robert and from Brandon about the different models that are available, the demonstration of these models, and really trying to show how they can tackle these problems and identify where these communities are that they can serve. So really, an all hands on deck approach, and discussions like these are very instrumental in trying to address some of these issues.
Great, thank you, John. And finally, Joel, final word and closing statement, please, from the Philippine Space Agency.
Well, yeah, thank you again. Well, what does the Philippines need? Fundamentally, it's for the government itself to lead in ICT utilization. That is, to be pervasive user of ICT, you know, whether it's anchor tenancy or, you know, and promoting its pervasive use, to be the #1 user of ICT by itself. So along with promoting new and emerging technologies and spurring their development, setting the policy environment to encourage new and emerging technologies, so to enhancing a regulatory environment for service providers to perhaps experiment with emerging internet technologies, and that can serve as further evidence or trigger an impetus to support further ICT policy and regulatory reforms. Now, on incentives, companies establishing these networks and satellites, I should mention, they're already considered in the current 2020 investment priority promotions plan. And there's a strategic investment priorities plan, SIPP, that's up for signature of the president. So the passing of this SIPP is a way of encouraging more investments in the telecoms industry, and it provides incentives to those establishing their infrastructure in rural, remote areas and geographically isolated and disadvantaged areas. Now, well, I think that for us to better appreciate the space segment and, well, the value that space technology in general can bring here, we probably only need to take out a map. You know, the Philippines is an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, stretching over considerable latitudes, not to mention being situated in the Pacific Ring of Fire and the Typhoon Belt. And so that's what we are and where we are, geographically speaking. We're surrounded by water. 77 million Filipinos traveled on the Philippine Nautical Highway system in 2018. So more Filipinos travel by boat than airplane, and they need connectivity while on the move. There are small fishing boat operators who need access to and need to send information, marine resources that need to be preserved and protected, and a blue economy that's waiting to be harnessed. So there's a lot of additive value from the space segment for communications in seas and during emergencies and disasters. We haven't even touched on that. So having that robust vantage point from space is an imperative. So we've seen how connectivity is crucial when we are confined to our homes during the pandemic, and also now as we're trying to get back on our feet. And so final word, well, space, you know, from the Philippine Space Agency's perspective, of course, can bridge, uplift, and empower our nation and bring hope to the people. And these satellites can bridge our islands and communities, and innovations in space can inspire and uplift us. And so, and it's also quite empowering. So that's why PhilSA is here. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And I guess final word from me for our audience. The Philippines is open for business. Please come in and help us bridge the digital divide, and you will profit from that endeavor. Thank you so much, gentlemen. And for our audience, please watch out for other webinars upcoming from the APSCC. Thank you and have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.